Hi, I'm Marcin Kuśmierczyk. Welcome to Eastern Insights. Why does Eastern Europe's perspective on global affairs matter? Because here, history and geopolitics collide in ways that shape our world. Yet these voices often go unheard. This podcast bridges this gap. Each episode translates in-depth analysis from my Polish YouTube channel, Polityka Zagraniczna, which means international politics. For the last few years, this platform has dissected foreign policy, security, and the forces shaping Eastern Europe. Using AI tools like 11 Labs, we adapt these nuanced insights into English, preserving their depth while making them accessible to all. Whether we're unpacking Russia's latest moves, EU debates, or security challenges in Central Europe, our mission is simple: to foster informed dialogue by sharing Eastern Europe's untold stories. If you're curious about the world beyond headlines, subscribe now. Join me as we decode the complexities of global affairs, one Eastern European insight at a time.
The world economy. It's feeling pretty turbulent lately, right? A lot of that, honestly, stems from the policies we saw implemented under Donald Trump's administration. And that turbulence? It's sparking new ideas. Genuinely new ways to think about rewiring economic relationships across the planet. One idea that's really gaining traction, especially from a European viewpoint, goes something like this. What if, ignoring America's very clear drive to slash its trade deficits, the rest of the world just carried on, maintained the current system amongst themselves, and the proposed foundation for that, from our perspective here in Europe? Well, some are suggesting it should be a close economic union between Europe and China. But hang on a second. Is an alliance like that even truly possible? Let's dig into it. All right, so this Europe-China idea, it really follows on, logically, from our previous discussions about how a new economic order is actively taking shape in the world. If you missed those episodes, I definitely recommend going back and giving them a listen. They provide some crucial context. The core issue here? America is clearly changing its tune on international trade. It wants to dramatically reduce its massive trade deficit. Now, that deficit, it's actually been one of the hidden pillars of the very dollar-centric economic system the Americans themselves built. Again, we covered that fascinating paradox in earlier episodes. Because of these actions from the US, Europe and China find themselves, well, in a somewhat similar, if restricted, boat. Why? Two main reasons. First, both Europe and China are heavily focused on exports. They sell significantly more to the world than they buy. They run substantial trade surpluses. Second, for both of them, the United States is their single biggest, most important export market by a significant margin. So you can see why, just on the surface, their interests might seem to align. Both China and Europe would clearly prefer fewer trade barriers. Both would benefit immensely if the old system just kept ticking along smoothly. Their export-driven economies, and honestly, the social models built upon them, kind of depend on it. And if you just stay at that superficial level, it sounds perfectly reasonable, doesn't it? Two major economic forces with a similar outlook banding together, fighting to maintain globalization, to keep the current trade rules firmly in place. And indeed, recent months, weeks, even just the last few days, have seen a flurry of what you might call diplomatic love letters, mostly flowing from Beijing towards Brussels. But you do see some reciprocal warmth traveling the other way as well. China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, has publicly spoken out strongly in favor of Europe's strategic autonomy. He's even called for a joint defense of globalized trade. You're seeing articles popping up in major European newspapers, like the Financial Times, where Chinese voices are arguing why they should team up with Europe, why China genuinely wants to reset relations. The narrative is simple and repeated often. The bad Americans are wrecking global trade, so Europe and China need to tighten their economic bonds, trade even more with each other. It's a classic play, really. China aims to maintain access to the lucrative European market, while dangling the ever-tantalizing prospect of greater access to the vast Chinese market. That legendary visa to El Dorado that, despite all evidence to the contrary over the years, still seems to captivate so many Western minds. Surely, the thinking goes, there are incredible, untapped riches just waiting for European businesses in China. And as often happens when dealing with Europe, external powers sometimes target specific member states, the ones they perceive as being easier to convince, perhaps more pragmatic or less aligned with the US. They try to amplify certain voices within the complex internal European debate. So, just recently, we saw Spain's Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, receiving a remarkably warm welcome in China. By the way, I really encourage you to read the official Chinese communiqué that came out of that meeting. Not just for the content, which is fascinating, but the style. It's a great example of just how different Chinese official communication is from the drier, more direct Western style. Lots of, shall we say, flourishes. You can find a link to it right there in the show notes, along with links to all the data sources I'm referencing. Anyway, according to that Chinese statement, Xi Jinping views the EU as a vital pole in the multipolar world. He states clearly that China supports EU unity and growth. He talks about partnership for peace, growth, reforms, even civilization itself. The message is clear. While the Americans, particularly under Trump, might see the EU as a threat, remember Trump saying the EU was created to rip America off? China, on the other hand, is explicitly presented as Europe's steadfast, supportive friend. We need to face challenges together, the message goes, by strengthening cooperation. Sounds like China really cares deeply about Europe, doesn't it? And, in a way, why wouldn't they? From a purely strategic standpoint, it makes sense to try and pry Europe away from the US orbit. But hold on a second. While the surface situation looks similar, both powers seemingly wanting open trade, if we dig just a little bit deeper, things start looking, well, not so similar at all. The perspectives diverge quite significantly, both because of the sheer scale of their dependence on the old system, and for straightforward, unavoidable political reasons. Politically, let's face it squarely, the European Union isn't a single, unified entity like a state. It's a complex union of sovereign nations. And many EU members rely heavily, arguably fundamentally, on the United States for their security. Especially now, with a major war raging right next door on the continent's eastern edge. So, for many European capitals, their relationship with China will always be viewed and managed through the prism of their relationship with Washington. That's just the geopolitical reality of the situation. And the Americans, for their part, are not mincing words about this. The US Secretary of State basically said, point blank, that economies cozying up too closely to China would effectively be cutting their own throats. It's crucial to remember this. US trade policy right now isn't just about abstract economics or balancing ledgers. It is intensely, almost aggressively, political. Those tariffs, the tough talk from Trump and his team, it's not always about precise economic calculations or optimizing trade flows. It's very much about forcing subordination, getting specific countries, getting institutions, getting the whole international system to effectively bow to American demands and priorities. America absolutely will use its significant leverage, particularly Europe's deep-seated security dependence, to try and pull countries away from China. They're quite open about this strategy. The message is implicit, and sometimes explicit. Maybe we'll let you trade freely with us, if you reduce your trade and economic ties with China. It's pretty blatant power politics, so you have this clear tug-of-war happening. The Americans trying to pull Europe away from China, and the Chinese trying with increasing vigor to pull Europe away from America. But even that, even understanding that geopolitical tug-of-war, is only part of the story. And maybe, perhaps, not even the most important part. Because the fundamental positions of Europe and China within the global trade system, they are vastly, fundamentally different. Yes, that statement from the beginning is true. Both Europe and China are export-focused economies, running significant trade surpluses. And yes, the US is the biggest single market for both. But look closer at the numbers. Look at the hard data. The scale of dependence is drastically different. Europe does have a trade surplus. In 2024, it was projected to be around 150 billion in the black. Roughly 147 billion, let's call it. That's significant. A lot of money flowing in. However, in that same year, China's projected surplus? A staggering $992 billion, nearly $1 trillion US dollars. Today, China accounts for roughly 1/3, that's 1 in 3, of all global manufacturing output. Think about that for a second. China produces more manufactured goods than the United States, Germany, Japan, and South Korea combined. Their entire economic model, their foundation, is built on a combination of cheap energy, cheap labor, massive state subsidies for production, and then aggressive, relentless exporting, flooding global markets, racking up enormous surpluses. That is the core engine of the Chinese economy. As a brief side note, this dramatic shift to industrialization has also made China heavily dependent on food imports, as so many people moved from farms to factories. But that's a story for another day, a different episode. Now let's look specifically at trade with the United States, the very source of all this current disruption and geopolitical friction. Again, the headline seems similar. America is the top export destination for both Europe and China. But look closer at the specifics of the trade balance. The U.S. trade deficit with China in 2023? Around $295 billion. That's just in goods. The U.S. trade deficit with Europe in 2023? Around $157 billion. Also just in goods. Already right there, you see a big difference in the scale of dependence on the U.S. market for goods exports. But wait, there's more to the picture. When it comes to services, think things like payment systems, software, cloud computing, all those digital services you're probably using right now to listen to this podcast. The United States runs a massive, significant surplus with Europe. We here in Europe rely heavily on American services. If you factor in both goods and services trade, the overall U.S. trade deficit with Europe shrinks dramatically. Down to just 48 billion, that is a very different number than the goods-only figure. Now, America also runs a services surplus with China, but it's much, much smaller. Only about $26 billion. Why the difference? Because China, unlike Europe, has actively and successfully built its own massive digital infrastructure, its own powerful service providers, effectively replacing many of the American companies that are dominant elsewhere in the world, including in Europe. So you see, the numbers, the actual data, tells a very different story beneath the surface. What looked like a similar situation, two export powers facing U.S. pressure, is actually worlds apart in terms of economic structure and dependence. The European economic model, while export-oriented, is not as purely dependent on exports as China's. Here in Europe, we primarily trade with each other. That is the immense power of the single market. The free movement of goods, services, capital, and people within Europe drives a huge amount of our overall economic activity and prosperity. And our total trade relationship with America, especially when you include services, that $48 billion overall deficit? It's significant, yes, but it feels manageable. It could potentially be balanced out over time by increased U.S. purchases of European resources, some strategic shifts in tariffs, maybe even higher European consumption if wages rise. For China, dealing with that nearly $300 billion goods deficit with the U.S., there is no easy fix. China absolutely cannot simply absorb the potential loss of the American market through domestic demand alone. Its fundamental dependence on exports, and specifically on the U.S. market as the primary outlet, is far, far greater. The structural imbalance is profound. And perhaps this is precisely why Europe and China have reacted so differently to America's protectionist actions. The Chinese have gone hard. They've responded aggressively. Because for them, this is, in a very real sense, existential. Their entire economic foundation, their social stability is at stake. They cannot easily back down from this fight. Europe, meanwhile, we can perhaps afford to wait and see a bit more. Especially now, with the 90-day suspension of some of Trump's tariffs still in effect, and some signals that Trump himself might be softening his stance slightly, maybe shifting the rhetoric towards potential trade deals, perhaps even with China, rather than just tariffs. So, for Europe, the strategy of wait and see, which, let's be honest, might just stem from our usual, often criticized inability to make quick, decisive geopolitical decisions, could actually, paradoxically, work out this time. But the differences go even deeper than just trade balances and political maneuvering between capitals. There is a more fundamental clash of core interests brewing beneath the surface. Think about it this way. If the global trend is genuinely towards increased protectionism, towards more trade barriers being erected worldwide, what does that inevitably mean for export-focused economies like Europe and China? It means they become even fiercer competitors against each other, fighting tooth and nail for access to those shrinking global markets. Europe and China won't be partners in shared prosperity. They will almost inevitably become rivals, scrambling for a smaller, more contested economic pie. But even that is arguably secondary to the absolutely fundamental point I want to make. The world of the future, it seems increasingly likely to favor nations, or blocks of nations, that can successfully maintain production at home. Nations that control their own critical supply chains, that foster genuine technological independence, and that can sustain the social stability that comes from having a robust domestic industrial base and good jobs. So, how on earth does Europe propose to achieve that? By forming a close economic alliance, perhaps even a union, with a country whose entire economic model is based on aggressively conquering markets through price dumping. A country structurally built on absorbing economic space and industrial capacity from others? How do we maintain and rebuild production in Europe when we are partnered with the world's single largest goods producer? A producer whose very success depends on outcompeting everyone else on price and scale. Everyone talks constantly about America's huge trade deficit with China. We hear about it all the time in the news. But guess what? Europe has basically the same problem, and the scale is massive. Our trade deficit with China is enormous. Chinese data suggests it's around $250 billion. EU data, using a slightly different methodology, suggests it was over $300 billion in 2024. Just look at the charts from Eurostat. They make it crystal clear. America is Europe's biggest export market. Over 20% of our exports go there. Losing easy access to that market would hurt, no doubt about it. But China is where over 21% of all the goods coming into Europe originate. It is our biggest import source by far. Europe runs its biggest trade surplus with America. Europe runs its biggest trade deficit with China. And now, the proposed solution to the problems caused by U.S. protectionism is to tie ourselves even closer, perhaps inextricably, to the very country with which we already have our largest, most challenging trade deficit? Forgive me if I'm missing something, but based on the data, that sounds abstract at best, almost nonsensical from a strategic economic perspective. The idea that China, whose economic engine depends on pushing production outwards, wouldn't use closer ties with Europe to simply cement its dominance in the European market, to capture even more economic space, to take over more and more industries, that they would somehow offer Europe special, favorable treatment? It seems completely detached from economic reality. China desperately needs outlets for its massive, subsidized production capacity. And yes, Perhaps for a very short while, cheaper Chinese goods flooding the European market because they can't go to the US. Maybe that feels good for consumers. Lower prices. But we'll very quickly wake up in a reality where European industry can't produce anything competitively anymore. Because how exactly do you compete on price with heavily subsidized goods pouring in from outside your market? Of course, the Chinese can still play on that old, powerful illusion. Access to our market will solve all your problems. Think of the billion consumers waiting for your products. But China, fundamentally, cannot afford to genuinely open its market when its own core priority is pushing its excess production outwards. Their economic model requires conquering other markets, not opening their own to equal competition. Meanwhile, from our European perspective, the vital, existential interest is clear. We absolutely need to keep the industrial production we currently have, ideally onshore more of it, and crucially, join and compete effectively in the global race to develop and manufacture new, advanced technologies. That applies to the continent as a whole, and it certainly applies with particular urgency to countries like Poland. The idea that we can achieve that vital goal, hand in hand with China, it just doesn't compute when you look at the economic models and the data. The Americans, for all their arrogance, for all their sometimes clumsy methods, for all their apparent blindness to how the old system actually benefited them in the long run, they might, just might, be right about one fundamental thing. China's aggressive export and industrial policies do, structurally, hollow out production elsewhere. One country dominating a third of global manufacturing capacity. You see the effects everywhere you look. At every industrial fair, in more and more sectors across the global economy. Growing Chinese dominance, even down to basic components and semi-finished goods, they are becoming unavoidable in supply chains. And this leads us back to the fundamental question, the one that might define the next era of economic competition. Does China need access to our markets more desperately because its domestic model depends on it? Or does the rest of the world, including Europe, need access to cheap Chinese production more because our supply chains have become so deeply dependent? Maybe it's just my own limitation, my lack of imagination. But I truly, genuinely cannot picture a plausible scenario where Europe successfully reindustrializes, significantly boosts its overall competitiveness. All the things the EU talks about constantly. Defends its jobs, defends its technology base, joins the critical tech race effectively, and does it all successfully while partnering closely with the world's biggest manufacturer. A manufacturer whose entire model depends on aggressive, subsidized exports. A country we already have a huge, structural deficit with. And doing all of this, somehow, against the wishes of the country, our security ultimately depends on. It seems far, far more likely that if China is genuinely pushed out of other major markets, and Europe doesn't quickly put up its own smart strategic defenses, that production surplus will flood into our market with double force, potentially washing away the remaining foundations of the European economy. It's hard to imagine any other outcome based on the dynamics at play. We simply have to react somehow, not necessarily by breaking off all relations, that's unrealistic, but by managing them smartly, strategically, with the clear goal of becoming a more autonomous, more resilient economic power ourselves. And right now, our most significant, most challenging economic dependencies lie far more heavily with China than they do with the United States. Transition sound. So, we are watching a truly fascinating, potentially historic, period unfold right before our eyes. A new global economic order is being forged in real time, and the dust is far from settled. Keep a close eye on the end of July. There is a key EU-China summit scheduled then, and around the same time, that 90-day suspension period for American tariffs is set to end, potentially bringing back the direct pressure. As I mentioned, the Americans do seem to be softening their rhetoric slightly, looking for deals, not just confrontation, It is impossible to say today how this will all ultimately shake out. Who will win in this complex economic reordering? But paradoxically, Europe's famous, sometimes frustrating, indecisiveness. It might actually, for once, be an advantage right now. As both China and the US pressure Europe relentlessly to pick a side, demanding clarity, writing articles about how the time for sitting on the fence is over. That very pressure actually strengthens Europe's potential negotiating position. Why? Because the two most powerful players on the global economic stage are suddenly very, very interested in what Europe thinks, what Europe wants, and which way Europe will lean. Maybe, just maybe, where two are fighting fiercely, the third one, if it plays its cards right, just might benefit. Regardless of the final outcome, the coming months are going to be absolutely fascinating to observe in this space. And I sincerely hope you'll stick with us here at Polityka Zagraniczna as we continue to track and analyze it all. Thank you so much for your attention today. I truly hope this gave you some new perspectives on this complex, critical, and rapidly evolving topic. If you want to catch up on the previous episodes in this series, where we discussed the foundations of the dollar system and the changing US trade policy, the links are right there in the description for you. And if you find these discussions valuable, if you appreciate the deep dives we try to take here, please consider supporting the channel through Patronite. Your support really does make these kinds of detailed analyses possible. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.